Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented each week at this time by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's the 22nd week of 2013. And the U.S. has been carrying on wars in the Middle East for 2 generations, practically since the end of the Second World War. The reason is not far to seek. If the principal product of the Middle East were asparagus, we wouldn't have half the American military there. But in fact, it's oil. Today, the U.S. government is threatening, invading, and occupying countries in a vast circle with a 2,500-mile radius around the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to the borders of India and China, a region sometimes called the Greater Middle East. The U.S. military calls it Central Command. This region has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and our government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars month after month to control it. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what our government demands. We, in fact, import very little of our own oil supplies from the Mideast. Most of it comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of world energy supplies gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. As a result, the bulk of our military budget, on which the U.S. spends more than the rest of the world combined, is spent on controlling transit routes in oil-rich regions, pipelines, and shipping lanes, and to control the countries, of course, in which these routes are based. To put it another way, President Obama is killing men, women, and children in Asia and Africa in our name because China and other countries need oil, and our government intends to have control over where they get it. Our government says that we're conducting these vastly expensive wars to stop terrorism and protect civilians. But we can see that instead we're killing civilians and creating terrorists. These wars are not in the interest of 99% of Americans, because it's practically only the 1% who profit from them through armaments and oil. In a way, the criminal attacks of 9/11/2001 were a godsend to the U.S. government, who could now pretend that U.S. Mideast wars were not to control oil, but rather to fight terrorism. The U.S. government had to make people ignore the fact that many people in the rest of the world noticed. When they condemned the 9/11 attacks, they saw them accurately as counterattacks to America's wars for the control of oil. The Obama administration is continuing and intensifying the Bush administration's war for oil. Obama has already killed as many as 5,000 people through drone strikes and his global assassination program, including American citizens and at least 200 children. Obama is simply lying when he says, as he did in a major speech this week, that he's killing people to fight terrorism. Unless we understand that terrorism is the U.S. government's label for armed resistance to our invasion and occupation of the Middle East. Obama's problem is the American people, who don't want more war and are suffering from the administration's economic policies. But politicians, bankers, and corporations do want war, so it's clear whom Obama is working for. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it is put into practice by President Obama. Tonight we'll begin with Ron Szoke, Jam Tomorrow.
This is a phrase you may recognize, much repeated afterwards, in Lewis Carroll's work through the
Alice in Wonderland?
Yeah, Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass.
Yeah,
and Alice encounters the White Queen, who says that the rule there is we have jam every other day, and you had it yesterday, you can have it tomorrow, but you can't have it today. And so tomorrow, when it's today, you can't have it then either, because then tomorrow will be today, and the rule is still jam yesterday and jam tomorrow. So you can have jam only every other day. So this is something that keeps receding into the future and is never quite grasped or fully in hand. So there were some aspects of Obama's speech about the future of American military and foreign policies that reminded me of this. The war against terrorism still goes on. The enemy is continuing to be vague and indefinite. The authorization for the use of military force, that's the supposed legal basis of all of this, turns out to have in the mind of the Pentagon, apparently the State Department, the CIA, and the White House itself, no limits in time and space. So it could still be going, for all we know, 100 years from now, but then it will still be perhaps jam tomorrow. So we don't know where it will end. We're just promised, we're told that all wars must end eventually, but we're not given any hints about how or when or where. So what I'm guessing this has led to, this indefinite war against an undefined enemy that goes on endlessly for over a decade now, and will probably go on endlessly because there are too many people in this country who are benefiting from endless war. Perennial war that we're told is needed to bring about perennial peace, but that too seems to keep receding into the future. So I think it's destroying the United States military. We're hearing more and more from various scattered sources about the degeneracy of the U.S. military as reflected in suicides, murder rates, sexual assaults. And this is a compound, both, I think, of the despair and cynicism in the military, plus the same features of American popular culture generally. Also, there's been a general exhaustion, I think, of the public on this issue. Generally, of course, any administration can whip up some war fever in the short run by claiming that we're under attack and we must reply to this terrible assault, this horrible crime against us. And this has led to the growth of American militarism since the late 1930s, actually. Already, someone was writing about the rise of the garrison state in 1941. Since then, it's shifted to talk about the national security state, and then more recently, the surveillance state. So we've become, although many people I think would like to deny it, the most militaristic nation in the world. Where, the only possible rival for that position would be Israel. But this is what's happening to us. We're told that we must keep fighting on and on to overcome terrorism and keep killing all these people who are participants in terrorism, or they are terrorists, or they might possibly, conceivably, one day in the become terrorists. Anyway, they have bad attitudes or anti-American attitudes, and so we should. We're disposing of their children too. American propaganda emphasizes this aspect of things, and I got to thinking the other day of how important the influence industry is, both in military and civilian life in this country. We're hearing more and more about the psychological operations, psy-war operatives in the military, some of whom have been hired, according to one story, to try to decrease resistance to the XL pipeline from Canada to the Gulfport. And we can see some of their work. I wonder if I brought that with me. Full-page ad in USA Today saying that this is actually good for you. We have to keep that oil from China, and how completely benign it's going to be in increasing American jobs and prosperity and so on. So a decade, several decades of the USA being on a war footing is now thought to be, claimed to be, essential to our prosperity, to the thousands of jobs it provides. I've surveyed in here before all the tanks and airplanes that are being built. The tanks, especially, the military says they don't want and don't need, but they have to be continually built anyway because they provide thousands of jobs. Building them provides thousands of jobs in the Ohio district of some congressman. And just think about the terrible economic consequences if that were to be shut down. In Friday's USA Today headline, GAO, that's General Accounting Office, military propaganda efforts flawed. We can't even say that the component of the military that engages in psyops, psychological warfare, and the like, is not effective in winning hearts and minds because nobody knows how effective they are. So the line of this is that Pentagon propaganda programs are inadequately tracked, their impact is unclear, and the military doesn't know whether it is targeting the right foreign audiences, according to a government report obtained by USA Today. Notice the reoccurrence of the verb targeting, which has become very popular. So I hope you'll tell us who you're targeting today, Carl. Since 2005, the Pentagon has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on military information support operations, MISO. I thought miso was some kind of Japanese dish. But anyway, these propaganda efforts include websites, leaflets, and broadcasts intended to change foreigners' attitudes and behaviors in support of the U.S. government objectives, according to a report from the GAO. Some of them disclose the military as the source, others don't. So it's what's called black propaganda, where the source of it is not acknowledged. The Pentagon's response noted that it partly concurred with the GAO criticism, and the military is revising its tracking requirements for propaganda programs, has a pilot program to assess their effectiveness, and will soon publish revised guidelines that emphasize better planning. So, again, jam tomorrow. Meanwhile, what has happened to the military itself, I think, is unfortunate. I think we do need some kind of military, but whether the current configuration can be saved or redeemed in any way, I think is very much open to question. Another headline in today's USA Today, and it's one source that publishes these things that are kind of deviant sometimes, that you don't find in a lot of other places in the so-called mainstream media. Slurs threaten and sully the Corps. Marines' online posts investigated. Federal law enforcement officials are investigating a former Marine and several active duty Marines after they allegedly posted threatening and lewd messages on social media sites that targeted, that verb again, President Obama and a California congresswoman, according to a government official informed of the investigations. The former Marine was interviewed last week by the Secret Service for a threatening post against Obama, said the official, who spoke on condition of anonymity because the investigations are ongoing. So they've been posting obscene insults and accusations and threats, not only against Obama, but against a California congresswoman who has objected to some of the things going on, such as all of the recent wave, or recently observed wave of sexual assaults and so on. The U.S. Capitol Police police and the Secret Service are investigating. Some of the posts suggest that female Marines achieved their rank by performing sex. Another shows a female Marine on her knees with a snake being put in her mouth. A recent post about Spire, that's the female congressperson from California, refers to her in vulgar terms and accuses her of trampling First Amendment rights. So now they are starting to claim that their free speech rights are being trampled because of this. So tell me, Carl, should military personnel be allowed to engage in obscene insults, accusations, and slanders against their superior officers and the president in the name of free speech?
Of course. If you simply shut them up and say you can't say that and stop any of expression of that thing, of those views, while the actions continue, you haven't got very far. It seems to me what you've got to do is take seriously the what you called the degeneration of the U.S. military. It's the actions and the attitudes that have to be dealt with, not the words that come out of the mouths of our soldiers. You make an important point about the military too, I think, Ron, in regard to the comparison with the late 1930s. When we talk about the war that the U.S. is conducting right now in Southwest Asia and Africa, and I think it's worthwhile talking about it as one war, our comparison is not to the war in Southeast Asia in 1969, but the war in Europe in 1939. And I mean the comparison is in terms of what the U.S. is doing. In 1939, the American administration rather cynically involved itself in the European war when there was a extremely strong anti-war feeling in the United States. And they did it in part because the New Deal wasn't working. That is, the economy was not reviving from the Great Depression quite the way it should. But as you pointed out, military production does wonders for a moribund economy. Maybe even a death-dealing economy, too. And the war and rumors of war were instrumental in bringing the Great Depression of the 1930s to an end. So much so that when the war ended in 1945, the American government was very worried the Depression would come back. Because if the war was what cured the Depression, then the war being over, the Depression will be back. And a lot of the policies of the American government in the 1950s, in the late 40s and 50s, can be interpreted in terms of that fear. We're in a similar situation today. The Vietnam War was fought in a time of prosperity in the United States. The economy was doing well. People had jobs. There was not the great crisis of unemployment and personal poverty that has spread throughout the American economy today. So the war today is a very different war, and the economy is a very different economy in America, but the American government is using the war to deal with its economic problems as it has literally for generations. So these questions about the military and what's happening in the military and what the military is being used for are not separate from the general questions of how the economy is being manipulated for those who are well-to-do in America and what the general administration policy is. The problem is that there's not a lot of candor, it seems to me. There's not even a lot of honesty in terms of what the administration is actually doing on either the war or the economy. That's what we should be asking for, indeed demanding, in preparation for demand of a change in those policies.
Yeah, I agree that Obama's speech was endlessly ambiguous in crucial respects, and of course a successful politician must always do this. He tries to make everyone think that he's on their side, no matter what their side may be. So it's like a gigantic ink blot that anyone can see and in it whatever they want for the most part. So several people have noticed that.
It's a crucial point, and the point was vividly made by Glenn Greenwald, writing in response to the president's speech on Thursday at the National Defense University. Greenwald writes, "The hallmark of a skilled politician is the ability to speak to a group of people holding widely disparate views and have all of them walk away believing they heard what they wanted to hear."
Yeah.
Other than Bill Clinton, there's not been a recent American politician even in the same league as Barack Obama when it comes to that ability. His most consequential speeches are shaped by their simultaneous affirmation of conflicting values and even antithetical beliefs, allowing listeners with irreconcilable positions to conclude that Obama agrees with them. The highly touted speech Obama delivered last week on U.S. terrorism policy was a masterclass in that technique. If one longed to hear that the end of the war on terror was imminent, there are several good passages that will be quite satisfactory. If one wanted to hear that the war will continue indefinitely, perhaps even in expanded form, one could easily have found that in the speech. And if one wanted to know that the president, who has spent almost 5 years killing people in multiple countries around the world, feels personal anguish and moral conflict as he does it, because these issues are so very complicated, the speech will be like a gourmet meal. But whatever else is true, what should be beyond dispute at this point is that Obama's speeches have very little to do with Obama's actions, except to the extent that he often signals what he intends not to do. How many times does Obama have to deliver a speech embracing a set of values and policies, only to watch as he then proceeds to do the opposite, before one ceases to view his public proclamations as predictive of his future choices? Speeches, particularly presidential ones, can be significant unto themselves in shaping public perceptions and setting the terms of the debate. So Obama's explicit discussion of the ultimate ending of the war on terror can be reasonably viewed as positive. But it signals nothing about what he'll actually do. I'm genuinely amazed that there are still smart people who treat these speeches as though they do. If the lethal presidency reminds us of anything, it's that we should be a long way from judging this president on his rhetoric or his portrayal of himself as a moral actor. Obama has a long record of broken promises and misleading rhetoric on civil liberties, and it would be naive to assume that he'll follow through on everything he said on Thursday. What Obama has specialized in from the beginning of his presidency is putting pretty packaging on ugly and discredited policies. The cosmopolitan, intellectualized flavor of his advocacy makes coastal elites and blue state progressives instinctively confident in the goodness of whatever he's selling, much as George W. Bush's swaggering evangelical cowboy routine did for red state conservatives. The CIA presciently recognized this as a valuable asset back in 2008. There's an important CIA document, secret then in 2008, when they correctly predicted that Obama's election would stem the tide of growing anti-war sentiment in Western Europe by becoming the new, more attractive face of war, thereby converting hordes of his admirers from war opponents into war supporters. This dynamic has repeated itself over and over in other contexts and has indeed been of great value to the guardians of the status quo and placating growing public discontent about their economic insecurity and increasingly unequal distribution of wealth and power. However bad things might be, we at least have a benevolent, kind-hearted, and very thoughtful leader doing everything he can to fix it. The clear purpose of Obama's speech was to comfort progressives who are growing progressively more uncomfortable with his extreme secrecy, wars on press freedom, seemingly endless militarism, and the like, to say nothing of the killing of children. For the most part, their discomfort is far more about the image being created of the politician they believed was unique and even transcendent than it is any substantive opposition to his policies. No progressive wants to believe that they place such great trust and adoration in a political figure who is now being depicted as some sort of warped progeny of Richard Nixon and Dick Cheney. That creates internal discomfort and even shame. This speech this week was designed to allow progressive once again to see Barack Obama as they've always wanted to see him, his policies notwithstanding, as a deeply thoughtful, moral, complex leader who is doing his level best, despite often insurmountable obstacles, to bring about all those good things, capital G, capital T, that progressives thought they would be getting when they empowered him. The terrorism speech, when dissected, provided very little, and it's worthwhile, by the way, to get the text of the speech. It's a little hard to find, but look at what he actually said, and you can see, in some sense, how it's done. It's like watching, from backstage how a magician is carrying out his tricks. The terrorism speech, when dissected, provided very little in the way of actual concrete substance. Its most heralded passage, as the ACLU quickly pointed out, did nothing more than call for the ultimate repeal of the AUMF. Ultimate. There's a lot of time between now and ultimate, right? The time to take, quote, the time to take our country off the global warpath and fully restore the rule of law is now, said the ACLU executive director, not at some indeterminate future point. Moreover, he noted the president still claims broad authority to carry out targeted killings far from any battlefield, and there is still insufficient transparency, and that's putting it certainly mildly. In lieu of substance, the speech was heavy on feel-good rhetoric, mostly designed to signal that unlike the mean and simplistic George Bush, who presumably pursued these policies thoughtlessly and simplistically, Obama experiences inner turmoil and deep moral and intellectual conflict as he embraces them. Quote, this is from the speech, "For me and those in my chain of command, those civilian deaths will haunt us as long as we live," the president claimed. He added that drones and other new weapons technology raise profound questions about who is targeted and why, about civilian casualties and the risk of creating new enemies, about the legality of such strikes under U.S. and international law, about accountability and morality, close quote. This "he who struggles so very much" conceit is one Obama officials have been pushing for a while, as when they anonymously boasted to the New York Times about Obama's deep personal involvement in choosing the targets on his kill list, something he insists upon because, quote, he is a student of writings on war by Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, the Christian saints, and wants to ensure compliance with those lofty principles. That's, I can't make this stuff up. That's from the New York Times, and obviously fed directly from the White House. The same article quoted the supremely obsequious former Obama advisor Harold Koh as hailing torture advocate and serial deceiver John Brennan as, quote, a person of genuine moral rectitude who ensures that the kill list is accompanied by moral struggle. Quote, it's as though you had a priest with extremely strong moral values who was suddenly charged with leading a war, close quote. That's from Koh again in the New York Times. Obama may do things you progressives find distasteful, but at least marvel at how thoughtful and torn up he is about it. The speech was a dense thicket of self-justifying argument, but its central message was perfectly clear. Please don't worry, liberals, I'm not George W. Bush. While the last president exuded a cowboyish certainty, this president is constantly examining his conscience in public. But if their policies are basically the same, the latter is no less of a performance. Bush's was a performance too, by the way. We sometimes, overlook that fact. But there were different performances. And there are ways in which it may be a more fundamentally dishonest one. Obama's may be more fundamentally dishonest because it perpetually promises harmonies that can't be achieved and policy shifts that won't actually be delivered. The U.S. should end its criminal war and bring its troops home. But where we don't actually intend to, we should be forthright about it, rather than pretending that change is perpetually just around the corner, and behaving as though our choices were justified by how much anguish we express while making them. Within minutes after the completion of Obama's speech, literally minutes, the New York Times editorial page posted a lengthy and gushing editorial headlined, "The End of Perpetual War." In their eyes, the speech was, quote, "the most important statement on counterterrorism policy since the 2001 attacks, a momentous turning point in post-9/11 America." Once again, you can't make that up. That's what the New York Times said immediately the speech was given. And by the way, they pick it up in this morning's edition. There's a long, long article about how this agony of reassessment in the Obama administration had gone on. Of course, there has been no reassessment. The New York Times, analyzed the speech section by section and insisted that each called for a shift that is essential to preserving the democratic system and the rule of law for which the United States is fighting, and for repairing its badly damaged global image. We might ask how the global image got so badly damaged, if that's what the U.S. is in fact doing, but that's another question. The New York Times concludes, "There have been times when we wished we could hear the right words from Mr. Obama on issues like these, and times we heard the words but wondered about his commitment. This was not either of those times." If you were to it defies parody. Here was the New York Times. How was the New York Times able to post such a detailed and lengthy editorial about Obama's speech almost immediately after its conclusion? Clearly, they were given a special preview of the speech by some administration official who fed them exactly the message the White House wanted them to receive, and they ingested it fully. The New York Times editor, as I say, continue it in this morning's paper. The New York Times editors got snookered not despite the special access they received, but because of it. Most of all, they got snookered because they wanted to, because, like so many progressives, they're eager to see Obama in the light in which they originally saw him. Nobody likes to believe they were fooled or tricked or so enthusiastically supported a politician who does things they find horrible. That's why a mere speech filled with all sorts of mixed messages leads the New York Times editors to all but declare that Obama has heroically ended the war on terror, even though just 1 week before, one of his top military officials told the U.S. Senate that the war would last at least another decade or two, another 10 or 20 years. Another 10 or 20 years. A New York Times editor heralded the speech as, quote, "a momentous turning point, making clear an ending state of war is unsustainable." But it isn't a turning point at all, as we will see in the coming weeks. In contrast to the New York Times' instant swooning, serious journalists and commentators who weren't given special pre-speech access to a marketing pitch by the White House began analyzing the speech's content and reached a much different conclusion. McClatchy newspapers, Jonathan Landay, who has been one of the few sane voices in the mainstream media on this, Landay astutely noted that Obama's formulation for when drone strikes could be used was broader than past government statements. They could do it more often, in other words, which meant he appeared to be laying groundwork for an expansion of the controversial targeted killings. That's just by the drones. The drones, remember, are only part of the global assassination policy that this administration is following. The Brookings Institution's Benjamin Wittes similarly observed that Obama's speech seemed written to align the president as publicly as possible with the critics of the positions his administration is taking, without undermining his administration's operational flexibility in actual fact. That's a word that should go into our special lexicon too, operational flexibility, i.e. they can do what they want, In other words, said Wittes, summarizing the vintage Obama rhetorical device, the president sought to rebuke his own administration for taking the positions it has, but also to make sure that it could continue to do so. Slate's national security writer Fred Kaplan observed this week that the speech heralded nothing new when it comes to drone strikes. except perhaps an expansion. In an interview with CNN's Jake Tapper, Jeremy Scahill argued this about the Obama speech, quote, "It really is sort of just a rebranding of the Bush-era policies with some legalese that is very articulately delivered from our constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize-winning president. But effectively, Obama has declared the world a battlefield and reserves the right to drone bomb countries in pursuit of people against whom we have no direct evidence or who we're not seeking any indictment against," close quote. That's Jeremy Scahill, whose new book, Dirty Wars, talks about how the Obama administration has actually fought these wars. The national security reporter Michael Hastings said much the same thing on MSNBC over the weekend. Quote, "That speech to me was essentially agreeing with President Bush and Vice President Cheney that we're in this neoconservative paradigm, that we're at war with a jihadist threat that actually is not a nuisance, but the most important threat we're facing today." Carnegie Mellon professor Kieran Skinner on the same show said, quote, "There was a lot of George W. Bush in that speech, as Obama spoke as though we are in a long-term ideological struggle in a way that he's not talked about radical Islam before, while where he's going will take him away from his liberal base." Ultimately, one can persuasively highlight passages in Obama's speech that support any or all of these perspectives. That's what makes it such a classic Obama speech. And that's the point. His speech had something for everyone, which is another way of saying that it offered nothing definitive or even reliable about future actions. No matter how good it made some eager-to-believe progressives feel, it's impossible rationally to assess Obama's future posture regarding the war on terror, secrecy, and civil liberties except by his actions. Until one sees actual changes in behavior and substance on those issues, cheering for those changes as though they had already occurred or are guaranteed is the height of self-delusion. There's been a talk in a number of places, Ron, in this last week or two about ways in which on this and other issues, the war issue in the largest sense, people raise the question, is Obama worse than Nixon? Well, whatever you want to say on that question, I was reminded, I'm old enough to remember, Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, saying at the height of Nixon's difficulties with his war, "Watch what we do, not what we say." Now, on the principle that nobody can be wrong all the time, it seems to me that John Mitchell was quite right about that. And that's exactly what we should do with the Obama administration. Watch what it does, not what it says, and not even what the New York Times says that it says, because the New York Times certainly seems to have drunk the Kool-Aid on this.
So it's jam every other day. But some of this, I'm afraid, is a limitation on any verbal or textual guide to action, what we should believe and do, whether it's the Bible or the Constitution or Obama's speech or whatever. There's always an inherent amount of vagueness and ambiguity in all of that that allows for different interpretations. And that's why we have judges and other people who must interpret those things to us. It's notorious that whatever your belief is, you can find some support for it in some biblical passage or whatever. But again, that's widespread. I would say it's perennial and universal, and that should be an element in our calculation here, too, I think.
In the words of the Attorney General of the most liberal administration since the Second World War, watch what we do, not what we say. Yeah. You've been watching Aware on the Air for the 22nd week of 2013. In the second half of our program, we'll bring you a video interview with Noam Chomsky. We want to remind you of other programs like ours here on UPTV, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. Weekdays at 7 a.m., Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, 8 a.m., The Big Picture with Tom Hartman. Tomorrow, Wednesday the 29th at 5:30 p.m., In Focus, Tahrir Square, A Place of Liberation. On January 25th, 2011, protests against the regime of Hosni Mubarak broke out on Tahrir Square in Cairo that led to the ouster of the Egyptian president. 2 years later, little remains of the euphoria felt by the young revolutionaries. Egyptians have experienced too much violence and too little positive change. At 6 p.m. tomorrow, Not Another Sports Show. Neil Parthon's WRFU radio show looks at sports from a progressive political viewpoint. At 10:30 p.m., The Populist Dialogues, Public Health and Social Justice. Dr. Martin Donahoe discusses the UN Declaration on Human Rights, trade in arms, and major social justice issues that affect public health, including corporate influence in the school system. At 11 p.m., Aware on the Air, a repeat of this show. On Thursday at 1 p.m., The Populist Dialogues. At 1:30 p.m., White House Chronicle. On Friday the 31st at 5 p.m., European Journal. 6:30 p.m., CU Immigration Forum. And at 7 p.m., News from Neptune. Thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Our programs are available on YouTube and Facebook. Search for Aware on the Air. And now this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.